From the Great Depression to the dawn of the 21st century, federal social policy promised to lift up working families, rebuild struggling communities, and expand opportunity for all. But in small towns and farmlands that surround the greater St. Louis region, places where churches often outnumbered schools, those promises were filtered through a distinctly moral lens. Faith, charity, and neighborly duty weren't just local values, they shaped how people understood federal power. From Roosevelt's New Deal to Johnson's Great Society and Reagan's War on Drugs, national leaders used the language of morality, a redemption, discipline, and salvation to solve their policies. And rural families, guided by their churches, their faith, decided which promises were worth believing. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the rural Midwest was already reeling. Farm prices collapsed, banks foreclosed on family land. Then the Dust Bowl swept across the plains, sending waves of displaced families east in search of food and stability. St. Louis became a landing point, a city of last resort. Along the Mississippi River, thousands built makeshift homes from scrap wood and tin. The largest Hooverville in the nation grew right here, stretching nearly 2 miles across the riverfront. Religious charities, Catholic missions, Baptist congregations, and Jewish relief groups became the first responders. Before Washington could mobilize, it was faith communities feeding the hungry and burying the dead. When Franklin D. Roosevelt launched the New Deal, he framed it as a moral rebirth. He called for a new covenant, echoing scripture, between the government and the people. Rural preachers echoed this message from the pulpit, seeing the WPA and CCC as instruments of divine mercy, a chance to restore dignity through honest, hard work. The Rural Electrification Act brought literal light to homes that had lived in a darkness, a symbol not lost on pastors who saw electricity as both progress and providence. But morality cut both ways. Some church leaders, especially in conservative and isolationist congregations, saw the New Deal as an overreach, replacing the moral duty of the church with the machinery of the state. And while federal aid arrived, local prejudice remained. In Cairo, Alton, and East St. Louis, black families were often turned away from relief boards run by white churchmen. Religion, like politics, reflected the segregated moral order of this time. Not everyone shared in the recovery. Federal aid often flowed through local boards, white-run committees that decided who was deserving, and black farmers and sharecroppers in the Missouri Delta and southern Illinois were frequently denied assistance or pushed off their land when subsidies favored larger landowners. Rural relief projects brought work, but also resentment. Some saw federal help as salvation, while others saw it as an intrusion. Yet the New Deal permanently changed the relationship between the federal government and rural life. For the first time, Washington promised not just to regulate markets, but to safeguard families. And that promise, however, was selective. Who benefited and who was left behind depended heavily on race, class, and place. And by the 1960s, President Lyndon B. Johnson was reviving Roosevelt's moral language, declaring not just a war on poverty, but a crusade for justice. Johnson believed that poverty was not a personal failing, but a collective sin, a failure of society to care for its weakest members. He described a great society as a moral mission, not just an economic one. The 1960s brought new programs that touched nearly every corner of American life. Medicare and Medicaid expanded access to health care. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act sent federal dollars to poor and rural schools. Programs like Head Start gave preschool-aged children a foundation for learning, and the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, sought to give folks an opportunity to buy safe, affordable homes. In rural Missouri and southern Illinois, the Great Society arrived through clinics, classrooms, and community centers. Federally funded community health programs brought doctors and nurses to towns that had gone decades without regular medical care. Hospitals were modernized through the Hill-Burton Act, which tied federal construction funds to promises for free or reduced cost care for low-income patients. And new Head Start centers opened across the Metro East, giving working-class children structured education. And for many rural families, this was some of their first meaningful contact with federal social programs. But But not everyone reacted positively to these policy changes. The civil rights movement, which had started in the decade before, had brought about Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act, which led to desegregated schools, attempts to end discrimination, and protecting the right to vote, which increased pre-existing racial tensions in the area. Urban renewal in East St. Louis also demolished entire black neighborhoods under the promise of modern housing that never came. Thousands were displaced and many relocated to nearby rural towns where schools and services were unprepared for the demographic shift. And as white families fled to newly built suburbs, the tax base that supported both urban and rural schools shrank. Federal funds temporarily filled the gap, but as they receded, inequities grew. Still, for a generation of rural Midwesterners, the Great Society represented the high watermark of federal investment in people. Health, housing, and education became the core measures of a community's well-being. And not all believers agreed on what justice meant. Evangelical and fundamentalist congregations increasingly framed government aid as a threat to traditional family values. Some resisted desegregation in schools and housing, arguing that federal mandates violated local autonomy and religious freedom. By the end of a decade, the Vietnam War and civil rights protests divided the nation, and religion itself began to fracture along political lines. The church that had once fed the hungry now faced a question: whose side was it on? When Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981, he spoke not just as a politician, but as a preacher of moral renew. He quoted scripture, championed family values, and promised to restore the nation's moral compass. But his policies told another story. Federal funding for housing, education, and community health was gutted. Mental health clinics closed. Federal welfare programs were demonized as handouts that eroded self-reliance. The war on drugs became a new national priority, and it reached deep into rural America. Small-town police departments across Missouri and Illinois received federal funds, military surplus equipment, and training to combat drugs that often weren't yet locally widespread. Meanwhile, economic desperation worsened. Factory closures across the Metro East in the 1980s farm crisis destroyed local economies. Families who once relied on farming or industry turned to low-wage work or substances that numb the loss. As resources for housing and health dried up, jails became de facto social service systems. Incarceration rates rose, especially among poor, black, and working-class white residents. Rural schools suffered too. With less federal support and declining populations, districts consolidated or closed. Children rode buses for hours to reach a school that might not survive another budget cut. The social contract forged under Roosevelt and expanded under Johnson began to unravel. And where earlier generations saw the government as a partner, the Reagan years reframed it as the problem itself. Churches played a complex role. Some became partners in rehabilitation and prevention, offering counseling, addiction ministries, and support groups when public health resources vanished. Others, influenced by the era's tough-on-crime rhetoric, supported harsher punishment as a form of moral correction. In rural communities already hollowed out by the farm crisis and factory closures, religion filled the vacuum left by retreating government services. Pulpits became platforms for survival and politics. Meanwhile, faith-based nonprofits began to replace the public programs that the Great Society offered, feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, and educating the poor, but often with fewer resources, narrower reach, and more moral prescriptions for the folks they were offering help to. This shift led to the privatization of compassion. From the Hoovervilles in the 1930s to the revival tents in the 1980s, religion shaped how rural Americans understood poverty, justice, and the role of government. The New Deal turned compassion into policy, and the Great Society transformed faith into federal investment, while the war on drugs fused religion and punishment into one. Today, that same moral language persists. We still debate whether healthcare is a right or a responsibility, whether housing is a service or a blessing, and whether education is a public good or a private choice. The promise of policy and the power of faith have always been intertwined. And in the small towns along the Mississippi, that marriage of belief and governance still defines what justice looks like and for whom it's meant.